Welcome to tonight's virtual panel for the American Dream Reconsidered Conference, Culture as a Gateway to the American Dream. We are lucky to live in a city that is blessed with outstanding cultural institutions. Many are well known nationally and many internationally. This panel will bring together leaders from three of those to discuss the role of the culture in urban life and as an avenue for the American dream. And what a central avenue it is. As the president of Roosevelt University, I recognize the importance of education, but I also know the kind of inspiration that can lead to a lifelong passion for understanding our world does not always occur in colleges and universities. Often it happens in the places we have represented on our panel today, in a library, or in the planetarium, or in front of a great work of Mexican art. The role that these institutions play, not just in creating a vibrant and energizing culture for the city, but in shaping the citizens of tomorrow, is immeasurable. And I feel very fortunate to have today's panelists with us to share their insight and understanding. I also want to thank our moderator, Professor of English, Dr. Regina Buccola, who serves as chair of the Humanities Department at Roosevelt University. Professor Buccola is our resident Shakespeare scholar and no stranger to the question of how to make great cultural works accessible to the people of Chicago. In addition to her scholarly work, she serves as the scholar in residence of the Chicago Shakespeare Theater and is a published poet in her own right. I cannot think of a more thoughtful moderator for tonight's discussion. So without further ado, let me turn the proceedings over to Dr. Buccola.
Thank you so much, Prez Ali. It is a total pleasure to moderate this conversation this evening. As Ali mentioned, we're extremely fortunate to be situated in Chicago, where I also came to do my graduate work and have spent a lot of time at the various institutions that are represented here this evening. So I want to welcome our panelists to join us. First, Daniel Green, the president of the Newberry Library, Michelle Larson, the president of the Adler Planetarium, and Carlos Tortolero, founder and president of the National Museum of Mexican Art. Welcome to all of you. So I'd like to invite each of you to take a few moments to introduce yourselves and your institutions to our watching audience and tell them a little bit about how you fit into the Chicago cultural landscape. Daniel, why don't you go first?
Okay, great. Thanks. It's really an honor to be here and part of the American Dream Conference. So thanks for having me. I'm a Chicagoan and so very honored to be the president of one of Chicago's oldest cultural institutions. The Newberry Library has been around for 135 years. We're an independent research library that collects material spanning the last 600-700 years of human history. And we pride ourselves on the fact that we are free and open to the public. There are multiple different collection strengths at the Newberry. One can study the history of Chicago. Genealogy and family history is very strong. We have one of the strongest collections of the history of indigenous people across the Americas, early modern history, the history of the book. And we have one of the largest collections of postcards at any public institution in the United States. So it's an interesting array of collections. And in addition to being a research library, we are an exhibition space, we're a program space, we're an educational space for lifelong learners in Chicago, and now very much with all the opportunities that the pandemic has provided to reach more broadly than just Chicago to national and international audiences as well.
Thank you. Michelle, over to you.
Well, thank you. It's so wonderful to be here, to be a part of the conversation we're going to have tonight. I'm at the president of the Adler Planetarium, and the Adler Planetarium is a young 92 years old compared to the Newberry Library. We were founded in 1930 as the first planetarium in the Western Hemisphere. And so Max Adler, our founder, was excited to bring to Chicago the opportunity for people to gather under the stars inside the planetarium dome and really connect with and explore the universe. Since that time, in the last 92 years, the Adler has grown. We now have a second planetarium dome, so 2 at the museum, as well as 7 exhibit halls and an observatory that is on the shores of Lake Michigan, where the public can come and put their own eyeball to the eyepiece and look at objects in the sky, both the daytime sky, the sun filtered, of course, and the nighttime sky. So we're excited to be on the shores of Lake Michigan here for Chicago. And we now also reach the globe with all kinds of activities for people to get involved in exploring and discovery and helping to further science, with millions of people around the globe as well. So we are here to connect people to the universe, but also to each other. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. It was in our founder's words to say that it is important that we connect with one another as well as the sky above. So I'm delighted to be here and look forward to our conversation.
Wonderful. So both of these institutions are very near Roosevelt's campus, and we've also hopped on the L to go visit Carlos on field trips. So Carlos, over to you to introduce your institution.
I'm very happy to be here tonight. We actually aren't that far away from you. We are the largest institution of our kind that deals with the culture of Mexico outside of the country of Mexico, which we're very, very, very proud. We feel blessed that we have this great culture that we have to work with. We were the first Latino museum accredited by the American Alliance of Museums, which is very, very important. We have a collection of 18,000 pieces, the largest collection of Mexican objects in the country. Our educational programs has won a lot of awards. Our after-school program is the only after-school program with youth in the country that won 2 White House awards. We do a lot of performing arts. That's very, 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 very important to us as well. We also serve as a cultural center, a community center. We have so many events that are non-museum kind of events. And one of the goals I've always had, and we've always had, is to redefine the definition of what a museum is. Too many museums are ivory towers. They don't interact with the public. That needs to change, especially when we're living in these very, very scary times. Our large, cultural institutions, museums need to be a voice, and they're not a voice. Too often they don't say anything because they think it's not their job. It is their job. Our country's in trouble. We need to speak up and be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
That's great. Thank you. I have certainly enjoyed some performances at your institution, Carlos. So you were talking there a little bit about some of the various constituencies that you serve at the end of that introduction, Carlos. And I'm wondering if all of you could speak to your audiences. So who have your audiences traditionally been? Who do you hope for them to be? And what challenges do you face in attempting to expand your audience base? So Carlos, do you want to start on that first, since you were talking about that a little bit?
Sure. Our audience historically, and we were founded in 87. We opened our doors in 87, founded in 82. Our attendance historically has been half Mexican, half non-Mexican. And to us, that's a perfect place to be. We want to preserve, conserve, present our culture for our own community. That is key. But at the same time, we've always had the goal to share our culture with folks who are not from our community. It's very, very great of people who come to the museum who are not from our culture, who say, hey, I want to learn from you. And that's key, because the culture, history of my community has been taught so badly. My favorite expression is the first cowboy wasn't John Wayne, it was Juan Wayne. So we're not about, rewriting history. That's garbage. We're about telling history correctly for the first time, not rewriting history. So I think we play a very, very important role in Chicago, especially since the Mexican community in 10 years all by itself would be the largest committee in Chicago. And in CPS schools, we're already the largest. So any discussion of Chicago that does not include my community is just not the right thing to do. It's just wrong, wrong, wrong.
That's great. Danny, I wonder if I could come over to you at the Newberry on this audience question.
Sure. So we're a research library in part. So I think the perception of the Newberry is that we're a place for scholars and students. And we very much want to be a place for scholars and students. But in the past few decades, we've really tried to open the Newberry to a much larger general public. Anyone can come in and do research at the Newberry, or obviously interact with our collections online. We're really emphasizing that we want an audience of the curious, right? If you want to learn something about the human past, if you want to learn something about who we are now and how we got here, there is something for you at the Newberry. Now, Gina, you asked about who we want our audience to be and who our audience is. I can't pretend there's not a disconnect there. We are, we're an 1887 institution that can be intimidating to some people. So one of the challenges of the institution right now is to make good on that promise to be free and open to the public. And we try to do that not only by kind of leaning back and saying our doors are open, come on in, but also in trying to show up for other people. And that's a real change at I think at museums and cultural institutions like ours that we've seen over the past few decades, right? A lot of building audience, I think, has to come through partnerships and showing up for people beyond the walls of your own building. I'm sure that's something we'll have the chance to talk about tonight. But that challenge between perception and reality can often be stark in institutions like ours, and it's something we're committed to working on.
Great, thank you. Michelle, what about you on this audience question at the Adler?
Yeah, I agree with what Daniel was saying. And at the Adler, when we were founded, it was really a motivation of technological advancement. Max Adler and others were really excited to bring the technology that was recently developed that could project the night sky inside, where you could gather and dive deeply into it. And for decades and decades, that evolved into a perception that the museum and planetarium was a place you needed to come to in order to experience the universe and what it had to offer. And we too were projecting for a very long time that idea that we had the answers, we had the things you needed to make your way to us in order to be a part of that. And we have instead, speaking to the audiences that we would like to have all those that want to come and see the beautiful objects and the projections onto the dome. But we realize also that the sky above is a sky that we all share. And wherever we are on this globe, we share a sky above. And wherever we are in Chicago, we share a sky above. And so in the last decade, we've made a very purposeful effort to help everyone celebrate that sky above, to help Chicagoans recognize that their block includes the sky above. And so we're bringing telescopes, we're partnering with local libraries and community groups so that they can operate telescopes in their neighborhoods. And Chicago's youth in particular are fantastic about sharing the night sky with others where they are. And we're working in the direction of recognizing that Max Adler's original words were about connecting to the sky above and to each other. He said to realize that we are connected to one another, and we want to really start there and bring that back so that we can feel that connection.
That's great. Thank you. So we're about 15 minutes into this conversation. I want to tell our audience that there will be an opportunity for the panelists to field questions from you toward the end of our time together this evening. So if questions occur to you as we are talking, please post them in the chat function that you have available, and they will get directed to us to field toward the end of our time together. So you were talking, all of you, in various ways in this last response about audience, about various kinds of disconnect between the internal and external views of your institutions. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the ways that you are becoming aware of those disconnects and some of the ways you're working to overcome them. So I know some of the answers. I'm an avid follower on Twitter of, the things that you post. And then, as I mentioned, I've been to see performances at Carlos's museum, which I very much enjoyed. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of these things that you're doing to bring those perceptions more into alignment. Michelle, what if we start with you this time?
Yeah, in the sciences in particular, I think we have misstepped in spending more time talking about what we know and want to tell you about than spending time talking about what is far greater, which is what we don't know and need your help in figuring out. And if not your direct help, at least your curiosity in wondering how it is that we got to where we are and what it is we're trying to still do. And so we are working very hard to put a focus on two things. One is that humanity in whole got us to where we are today. And I agree with Carlos, we need to really tell all of the stories of how we got to where we are, who was working to help us understand this, and to then help everyone feel that as part of humanity, humans got us here. Humans will take us the next step. Let's talk about the big questions that we're still working to figure out. Let's talk about how you can play a role in understanding that. So we're working to change the conversation so that we can focus more on why it's so important that we bring all kinds of ideas and minds and backgrounds and perspectives to the table when we're working on really difficult things to figure out. I know personally, I was in the STEM sciences when I was in school, thinking that somehow women couldn't do this work, but I could show others that we could. And I felt really tricked, quite frankly, when I, through my career and life, have learned that women have been doing this work all along, but no one told us, no one told their story. And wished I had had the perspective of realizing that I was continuing the contributions of women in science. The same for people that are helping from all different places in the world, that are helping from all different cultures in our own country. We need to make sure those stories are being told so that we all recognize that we can participate and we can contribute. So that's the way we're working to try to form this community and connection around why we've all been a part of getting us here and why we're all so needed to get us to the next step.
Thank you. Carlos, I wonder if we could go over to you on this one and have you speak a little bit about sitting at the helm of a national museum that is based in Chicago.
Well, to us, the key was always to be based in a working class neighborhood where our community was. So redefining what a museum is, redefining who your audience is. I remember years ago, a large museum in Chicago, which I won't mention, said they do outreach because they send faxes all around the city. It's unbelievable how things are done wrongly so many times. And I can tell you, when I started the museum and said, we want to be in Pilsen, a working class neighborhood, we want to be an art museum in a working class neighborhood, and we want to be free. I would say 90-something+ % of the people in the arts and culture world thought we were crazy. I bet you if you called them up today, 90+ would say they knew we were going to succeed. So I'm like Santa Claus. We're on a list of who's naughty, who's nice, okay? But it's important for us to change the whole mindset. One of my favorite things in the museum is when a group of kids come after school, they walk in and one says to me, "You still have that show up. I saw it last week. When are you going to change it?" And you explain to them, show it to be up for a while. What's the matter with you guys? Are you lazy? I love that. Because they're taking ownership of the institution. And I tell them, someday you're going to grow up and have a lot of money. I'm going to give you a phone call, okay? I want some of that. But I do think it's having the museum be theirs. I can tell you how many people come to the museum and say, we want to use your auditorium on such and such a day. And I say, oh, it's booked. No, you don't understand. I really need it. It's their space. And they act like their space. And that's what you want. I always like to say we want to be a part of the community, not a part from the community. That's very, very, very key to us. And I like to point out that a lot of people thought it's crazy for us to be free, but during COVID, we didn't lose any box office. We had no box office. Of course we accept donations. Of course we do. We aren't crazy. But what was interesting to us was the fact that what was a policy of accessibility, which is a key thing to us, being accessible to everybody, was also a good financial model. And I can't tell you how many museum directors across the country, even some in Chicago, surprisingly, have said, how are you free? And I tell them, we're free because we know it's important for us to be free. And if that's part of your philosophy, you find a way to make it happen.
Thank you. So Danny, what about you over at the Newberry?
Yeah, Carlos, I love what you're saying about, libraries people think of as free also. Of course, we need support from people, but that freedom of access is so important to us, and freedom of access to knowledge. And it did, I think it helped us weather the worst of COVID in 2020 and 2021. Hopefully, what's the worst of COVID in a way that was different than some other cultural institutions. And what Michelle is saying about asking questions, I think, is so resonant, right? For cultural institutions like ours, not to sit in a position of telling people what to think, right? But telling them what to think about, right? By choosing, obviously the exhibition topics that we choose or the program topics that we choose. It is an institution saying, we think this is a topic worth thinking about, but then really providing a space that we don't see as much in the United States for reasoned debate. We think a lot at the Newberry about enduring questions, right? The humanities are, depending on what your perspective is, either not as popular as they used to be or truly under assault, right? But part of it is that we, in humanities spaces like ours, we need to frame things in a way that matters to people, right? Through enduring questions. Who are we? How did we get here? What does it mean to be an American, for example? And I think when we found that when we can frame things, when we can frame projects in terms of enduring questions, we actually see that there is, or our audiences see that there is a deep value to the humanities, and they do care. I can give you one example about Chicago. In 1919, Chicago saw one of its worst weeks of racial violence in the city in the summer of 1919. And the legacies of that violence are still visible on the city today. And the Newberry led a project in 2019 on the 100th anniversary of this racial violence across the city. And we didn't do it alone. We partnered with a dozen cultural institutions around the city, right? So that was part of it, right? Getting beyond our walls and asking not only what happened, but why does it matter? And how do we see the legacies of that racial violence today? I think institutions have really wised up about thinking about, well, what is on people's minds? What are the most urgent issues on people's minds? Whether it's racial violence, whether it's climate change. Whether it's an assault on democracy, right? That Carlos talked about at the beginning of the program. And we both, institutions like ours both have things to say about this that help with deep context. And I think we can also be spaces where people talk about these issues, maybe in different ways. And we're committed to promoting that, to being a space where we can have real conversations, maybe even, shockingly with people who disagree with us, but in a respectful way, rather than in the way we see so often, in our media or public discourse out there.
That's great. Thank you. So many of you have touched on this pressing issue of what is happening in our democracy right now. So Carlos, you were speaking to this at the beginning of our discussion. And so I wonder if now we could turn to digging into this idea that all three of you have brought up in different ways, in different contexts so far. And that is the question of the role of cultural institutions in sustaining democracy. And what can your organizations and institutions contribute to a democratic society? And what does that look like during this moment when we seem to be so divided and seem to be experiencing so much incivility in these kinds of conversations? So Carlos, since you were speaking to this at the outset of our discussion, I'm going to turn this over to you first.
It's so funny that I've been talking about racism since day one I opened the museum. And they've always accused my museum of having an agenda. Well, you know what? When you have the large art museum showing predominantly white artists, that's not an agenda. It's an agenda. But the point is, we're honest about the agenda. We are for immigration rights. We're for things like that. The dreamers. It's important to us. And for example, recently the Museum of the Park, scheduled a meeting to talk about the topic they were concerned about. Why haven't we scheduled a meeting to talk about racism? That's what we should be having. That's 50 times billion more important than the issue they were concerned about. But they're so insular, cultural institutions, they don't see out, they see in. And the problem is they see the museum as a box. And the museum is not a box, it's an idea, it's a concept. It shouldn't be defined by a building. And so they really many times are out of touch with society. It does not make them bad people, it does not make them wrong human beings, but they really don't understand the society they're in so many ways. So how do you reach new populations when you don't understand those populations? That's a dilemma. And then I'm not saying this to insult the large institutions. I love these institutions. I want them to be better. I want them to serve everybody, but they have to change. They really need to change. When, books are being banned again, I mean, this is like crazy what's going on out there. Museums and cultural institutions should be the leaders. And they think, all because I voted for Obama, I've done my job, I'm a good human being, let's move on. So to me, it's a real issue. It's a real issue.
Thank you. Michelle, what about you? You were speaking about this earlier in our conversation as well.
Yeah, I think there's so much we can learn, not only from those that we invite into the conversation, agree or disagree, but across our different disciplines as well. When we think about how specialized a lot of the different disciplines have become because the problems have gotten deep or big or difficult, there's so much more we can still learn from one another by having these conversations across different perspectives, across different opinions. And so I think about space and astronomy, for example, and when we think about what it is we're learning, where we might be going, we have a sky show called Imagine the Moon right now that's in the museum that asks the question, who gets to go? And who gets to decide who gets to go? And that is a rich conversation that needs to acknowledge how we've not gotten this correct in the past as society, as countries who have gone off to take from others. And we need to think about, can we do this better? Can we have the conversations that we need to have? Can we acknowledge where we have not done well previously? And can we, as Daniel was saying, have the discussion about where we could do better going forward and how we could make different decisions than we've made in the past. So I think the richness comes in inviting opinions, differences, perspectives to the table, but that includes also recognizing that we all can learn from our own disciplines when we think about how we can go forward.
Great, thank you. You were just being referenced, Danny, so over to you.
Well, I think, look, we're living in a moment now where truth is under assault. And libraries are places that value freedom of access to information, right? And museums are as well. And we do know from audience surveys, both, over really the past 40 years, that museums and libraries and cultural institutions actually do tend to be trusted stewards of facts and evidence. I think that's critically important today to both say and live that value of freedom of access to information, and then to be a place where we can ask questions like, how do we know what we know, right? One of the reasons truth is under assault so much is we don't ask anymore, how do we know that's true? right? So we can ask that in the sciences, we can ask that in the arts, we can ask that in the humanities, right? How do we know that's true? How do we know what we know? We've stopped. One of the reasons truth is under assault is because we've stopped thinking about evidence. And how we know what we know. And I think that libraries and museums can be those kinds of spaces. And we can also be spaces where we face difficult pasts, right? If we're going to tell the truth about the past, then sometimes that truth is a somewhat ugly truth, right? Or more than somewhat ugly truth. But we have, I think we have a public trust in these institutions. And so then we have an obligation to help people ask those difficult questions about what is true and how do we know.
Gina, if I'm allowed to comment on that, I think what Daniel's saying is right on. There is faith in large institutions, museums, and libraries. And we can use that trust to lead the fight to change our society, to talk about social justice, to talk about racism, but it's not happening. And that's unfortunate because the public would say, wow, why is that museum talking about this? Why is that aquarium, planetarium? Why are they would pay attention. I think they really would. We wouldn't be a bunch of kids with hair from here to Pittsburgh, wearing all kind of earrings and, what I mean? I think they would trust us. And so the fact that we don't move on this trust and we're, cultural ostriches with our heads in the sand really bothers and disturbs me. The older I get, I know they have so much time left and I was hoping something would move, but I think we're going the other direction, unfortunately.
I think there's also a meaningful impact we can have by involving others, youth in particular, but citizens in general, in the journey of discovery and discipline of thought and fact finding. So I agree completely with Carlos that we need to be voices for the need for that and the importance of that. But an approach in which we take them with us along the journey and mistakes are made and you need to investigate what went wrong because that's how science works. That's how humanities work. That's how research works. Let's use that in general. And I think you develop a real understanding of why one can gather information and come to a different conclusion than maybe had felt before because you've brought yourself there on that journey. So it's a combination of speaking about it, but I think it's very important that we exercise and develop the skill to pursue knowledge and to be a part of discovery so that people can build that perspective on their own.
And this is a radical change for museums and libraries, right? Not to be seen as temples, right? But to be seen as forums, right? Where people shared authority, right? Where we're working with communities, with youth to co-create knowledge, which doesn't mean it doesn't mean devaluing expertise at all. But it's we're working on one of the Newberry's largest initiatives right now is for a 2024 launch is a exhibition and series of programs and educational resources on Indigenous Chicago. Right. So Chicago, the argument or the story is that Chicago has always been an indigenous place. But we can't do this alone as a cultural institution, right? We're working with indigenous communities across Chicago, including indigenous youth. And I think the change that cultural institutions have to make is in the conception of these projects to not walk in with all the answers, but in the conception of these projects to sit at a table together and co-create.
And to take it a step further, equally important to recognize that often you're the least expert in the room. And so it isn't devaluing expertise, it's leveling the fact that we all come with expertise in different areas. And we need, as the organizations that have typically proclaimed what we know, we need to recognize that we know some things, others know things we don't know. And that expertise comes in many forms about many different things.
Right.
But it's been very hard for large institutions to admit and accept the fact that they can learn from people who may not have PhDs, who may be from the community, who may work in a factory. It's very hard for the cultural community because it is museums, majority of museums, began as elite institutions, and for the most part are still elite institutions. So it's very hard for them to admit that somebody who's not in their field, who's not in their, college degree sense where they're at, to say that I can learn from them. It's very hard for them, and that's been a big hurdle for large institutions, to be able to have outside voices come in and say, this is what we need to do.
Yeah, I don't disagree, Carlos, at all. And I don't want to be Pollyannish, but I do think I've seen, at least in my 25-year career, some progress has been made. I don't know that we would have had this discussion in the same way 20 years ago. I'm not saying that to say that we're as far along as we should be. We're not. But I do have some hope that things are changing in the way that museums and libraries and other cultural institutions think about who is included in community and who's included in co-creation of content in these places. I mean, I don't think the progress has been quick enough, but I do think that something is changing, at least in the discourse.
But, for example, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusiveness, that's not the issue. Racism is the issue, but we can't say the word racism. Alcoholics Anonymous correctly identifies the problem and puts it in its name. We're alcoholics. We have to change. But we don't talk about racism. We really don't, cultural institutions. It's like a letter word that we don't want to discuss. And racism is the beginning of this country, and it's been the number one thing that really exists in this country. We're going to talk about America. Racism's always seemed to be in the heart of it, and yet we don't talk about it. It's like it's uncomfortable. It's like, racism is like cancer. And too many times, when we talk about, we do there, it becomes like a, kumbaya thing. We all hold hands and sing songs. It's going to go away. Racism is like cancer. It's an ugly thing. It's a painful thing. But we have to deal with it if we're going to overcome it. And we can't even say the word, so how can we deal with it? So there's been some progress, Daniel, I'll give you that. But we are still light years away from where we should be. And we're running out of time, the way this country is headed. So we better move fast.
But Carlos, I agree completely that if we can untangle, to Daniel's point, the places where we have demonstrated progress and then single out where we're not, which is in racism and exclusion of others. If we think about academic settings, as we're talking about, we are able to recognize the role and contribution that students and new scholars to the field, right? We label it, we have hierarchy of undergrads, graduates, postdocs, visiting researchers, faculty, all of that. But Carlos is spot on, which is that while there is an acceptance in academic settings for the perspective and the fresh ideas of those young in their careers or new to their careers, we have not done the work to say that same approach necessarily needs to be applied across and outside the bubble that we have worked in. And so that's where I would offer, I guess, a bridge between the optimism and the pessimism that we're hearing here, which is if we call out the fact that there is example of bringing new, young, inexperience into the conversation, but that is only traditionally amongst those that look like and have the same life path as the top, we need to then say, now it's time to broaden that and to take that same approach into the areas that need the most work.
But the cultural field, we're like, our doctors for cancer, we'll all be dead. Okay, we'll all be dead because they wouldn't really talk about the problem. And we have to talk. We have to talk about the problem. I get back to when there was a recent meeting by me in the park to talk about an issue that to me was not an important issue. Racism's the issue. Do we have meetings for that? Emergency meetings for that? Platforms, anything? No. So when you say things are changing, yeah, but when someone has 100,000 tons of crap and now there's 99,000 tons of crap, that's still a lot of crap, folks. That's just being real. And so what makes, it's progress, but not even at snail space. And, while we're having assaults on our government, unlawful assaults on the Capitol building, book banning, racism at all levels, boy, we have to get out there and, kick some rear end, not physically, but mentally, psychologically, and get out there and be leaders in the fight against racism. I never see cultural leaders attend anti-racism meetings. I go, I don't see anybody else go, and I just say they have to change. And I'll be honest and say that if they can't change them, then maybe they should leave their jobs. Let other people come in who are going to change, like baseball. If the team's not winning, you start all over again. Start with young players. Maybe it's time to do it in the cultural field, because we really are the danger point in this country. We really are.
I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. So I know that each of your institutions has, in fact, taken some strides in addressing difficult histories and difficult institutional relationships. So I wonder if each of you could speak to that a little bit. So Danny, you were heading down this path earlier, talking about the 1919 exhibit in 2019. But I know there have been some other initiatives at the Newberry. So maybe you would want to start off speaking to that a little bit.
Well, as a historian myself, I think it's, as I said earlier, I think it's really important to tell the truth about history. And these institutions often have not told the truth about history. At the Newberry, one thing that I investigated and researched during the COVID pandemic was that the Newberry owned multiple properties in the neighborhood around the library in the early 20th century and signed restrictive covenants on those properties. Restrictive covenants are, clauses in deeds on properties that would say that this property can't be sold to an African American or to a person of color or to a Jewish person. And I wrote about that in the for the Newberry's magazine. I don't pretend this is some huge leap forward, but I do think if institutions can't at least tell the truth about their own history, how do we help? How are we going to help across the city or beyond face difficult history? And I think we've seen similar things at some other institutions across the city. If we're gonna tell the truth about this difficult history, sometimes that means holding up a mirror to our own institutions, and that's one of the things we tried to do at the Newberry.
Thank you. And Michelle, I know you have some thoughts on this too, about the ways that certain groups have been marginalized in the history of science that you've been trying to uplift at the Adler.
Absolutely. So we are very much purposely working to tell the stories of those that have been involved in scientific work and discovery, especially in astronomy and space science, which is our focus, from all different LGBTQAI, from Black history, from the Hispanic and Latinx groups. We are working to say and uncover and talk about the examples whereby they are there and contributing and making a difference in what we know today and where we will go from here. And our purpose in that is twofold. It is to lift up and bring to the front the stories that have been hidden or suppressed and not recognized. But the second piece of that is so that those today who are of these communities can see that there's a history and a place for them to contribute as well. So working to acknowledge and take steps for the past, while also saying that is the step we can take in bringing more to the table, more voices and contributors to the progress that we're going to make next.
Great. Carlos, I know you have some thoughts on this.
No, I just think that it's important for arts institutions, large institutions, go on a retreat with your staff and your board and see what you can do. And it's, in my institution, it's not about saying Mexico's great, great, great. We have called out bad things that have happened in our community, the shading issues where if you're light skinned like me, you have advantages, even in my culture. So it's not just telling, we always know the good and bad and the ugly of our culture. It's important for us to be honest, for us to move forward. And I think, and we always talk about what can we do? And I think it's important for institutions to take a step back and talk among themselves and say, how do we impact society more? But remember, forever, even still today, cultural institutions think that having social justice issues is not their job. Let me tell a story, which is one of the most craziest stories I can even tell. Years ago, maybe about 10 years ago, a woman came to me and she was working with women in the community, okay, Mexicana woman, all 50 years or older, all Spanish dominant. Now, one ever had a mammogram before, not one. So she wanted it to hold a situation in the museum, an event in which she brought a nurse practitioner to show them how to look for lumps in the breast. Now, if there were 200 women, the chances are, unfortunately, maybe a couple of them found lumps that need to be examined. Do you know I was attacked at American Alliance Museums conference? Museums don't do that. What do you mean, do what? You're a museum of art. You shouldn't be doing that. We have an auditorium that it's empty that day, right? We're in the community because we want to be, not want to be downtown and we didn't get space. We want to be in the community. And here we're trying to save people's lives and we're being attacked. That's how ass backwards arts institutions can be. And as I'm saying, we still have so much room to grow and it's not happening. And folks, we're under attack now and we're not attacking back. I mean, if I was a betting man, I think the other side's going to win the way things are going, unless we change. But I don't see a real effort to change. I see little things, but not it's almost hitting you with baseball bats, and you have toothpicks to defend yourself. I mean, and so we really need to get out there and show that we can be part of our society, that we care of all members of society, not just the well-educated, not the wealthy, but all individuals from all cultural backgrounds. We're all Americans. Let's work together. But I don't see that happening. And I wish I'm proven wrong. I would love to be proven wrong. I would like to come back in 10 years and say, Carlos, you're wrong. I'll be a happy camper. I really would.
So I want to remind our viewing audience that you too have the opportunity to weigh in with questions here. So if you put them in the chat, we will turn to those in just a few minutes. And as we hopefully gather some questions from our audience, I wondered if we could return to something that all of you have touched on at various points in this conversation already. And that is the fact that funding must be sought. That in the case of the Newberry and the National Museum of Mexican Art, most exhibits and so forth are free that are there. And at the Adler, I know the ticket price doesn't cover all of the expenditure of maintaining all that scientific equipment, Michelle. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges of bringing in private funding, not only in terms of securing it, but also in terms of navigating some of the kinds of viewpoints that other people have about these institutions or objectives they might have for these institutions, and balancing that with the funding that you need and the goals and objectives that you have. So Danny, I wonder if you could take that first.
Sure. I mean, we are free and open to the public, but we struggle to make our budget every year, like most cultural institutions do. We have a very generous donor community. Thousands of people make donations to the Newberry every year, but what I talk to the staff about and what I always think about is what are we doing that's of value to people, right? It's hard to put a dollar amount on that value, but what kind of space can the Newberry be that is a learning space for people and an accessible space for people? And part of my message is trust the work that we're doing. Look, there's always needs of, infrastructure, whether, digital or physical. We always wish that we had more funds to acquire collections, for example, right? Compared to our peers, our purchasing power on the market is less than most institutions like ours. But I truly believe that if we do work of value to people, then the donations follow. It is a reality in cultural institutions like ours, though, that we need to be communicating that to people. I assume that this will resonate with Carlos, right? We talk about how deeply important it is to be free and open to the public, but that what we do is not free, and so that we always need that support.
Carlos, how about you? Danny kind of passed the torch to you there.
Well, to me, it's always been just why we're based in a working class communities. We wanted to, psychologically change the view that why does everything good have to be downtown? Why can't we have great things in the community? I mean, that is, so trying to change the concept of what a museum is. And being free was an important part of that. Now, do we need money? Yeah, we need it. Every year we need to raise more. But I'd rather go after corporations, foundations, rich people. And, but there are people, right before COVID, I was in the back of the museum and I was going to the front, and there was a Mexicano man there, and he had a jumpsuit on. So it looked like he had some blue collar job. And he was talking to his kid, and he puts $1 in our donation box. And the kid says, "Why are you giving $1? Because it's free." He goes, "We want to make sure it stays free." That man gets it, he gets it. And this is being in Spanish. And he turned around, I saw his name, so I think he was a car mechanic, and I thanked him profusely. But I think those changes are critical. To me, they're as important as a $10,000, $20,000 grant, because they understand what we're trying to do. And it's funny, here's a man who probably did not have a college education, I'm assuming, I could be wrong. And yet people who have college educated who are in the arts, they don't seem to get it. So there's just something, and that's one thing too, which is very key about racism, that people understand. You can do racist things and not be a racist. People understand. I mean, if you're going to teach that, Columbus discovered America, that's racist, okay? It doesn't make you a racist. So I do think understanding the way racism really exists and how institutionalized it is in our society. So when I hear people, there's no racism in the United States, I walk out with anybody and say, see that? So I think it's important. Now, first, being free. At one time I had, 2 kids in college, and my 3rd kid was in law school. How do we pay for it? I have no idea, okay? But the same at the museum, how do we stay free? Honestly, I have no idea, but it's part of who we are. And we made sure that we were going to do it. And I think when something's valuable to us, to who you are as a human being, as an institution, you will make it happen. And I do think, which is why, I have faith in humanity. I really think that if they said, I remember when, JFK said, we'll put a man on the moon in 10 years, and everybody in NASA engineers, they ran into the washrooms. They were so scared, thinking, what's he saying? But, it was accomplished. I think if we put our collective will to do it, we can do these things. And I think if we can solve racism, it'll be like a domino effect. Everything else will fall into place, because we will learn that we're not the same, which is good. I don't want anybody to talk the same, look the same, but we're all equal. And that would set us on a course where we can do great things in our system, in our planet.
Michelle, how about you?
Yeah, I think Carlos segues right into an important piece, which is we need to think deeply and make decisions about what is a public good. And if we agree together as a society that there are things that are fundamental public good, and I'm going to posit cultural institutions and experiences that have the conversations we've been talking about are public good, then we need to face the hard facts about how do we fund them so that they stay accessible and available. So we are primarily needing funding to support our amazing staff. So we pay Chicagoans to make a working and decent wage, And that's what most of our operating budget comes from. We do not have a fundamental business model that helps us understand how we do that with certainty, how we do that in a way that we can plan. We also have fabulously generous donors, and those gifts are needed and most often come with targeted specific purpose and a timeline on when the funds will come and be spent. But our staff are here day in and day out delivering this experience, and we want them to be here day in and day out for the future. And so being able to understand how we can have certainty in our funding model so that we can continue to support the people that make this happen is a challenge for us. Those same staff, myself included, value access and value the opportunity for people to be with us. So we are now open on Tuesdays and Thursdays for school groups only, and all Chicago school groups are free at the museum. So we want them to come and enjoy the skyline view, the best view of the skyline in Chicago over the lake, by eating lunch in our cafeteria, because the museum is all theirs on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and hearing teachers and school kids scream through the museum because no one else is there except other teachers and school kids to talk about, come see this, look what we're learning, do you have any ideas about this, is truly fantastic. And we are now also free every Wednesday night. We've opened our museum at night so that we can all enjoy the sky above from 4 to 10 p.m. And that we recognized we needed to do once we had done the work to be in the community, celebrating the sky above with everyone where they are, so that they want to come and join us for more, not just come make the trek to the Adler, but instead say, the Adler's where we are, we want to be where the Adler is, we're in this together. So we're making strides in the direction of our values, with Tuesdays and Thursdays for school groups only, and every Wednesday evening free for all Illinois residents. But we also recognize that we don't have a working business model. And so we pull together our operating budget through generous donors, through admission tickets, and through support from government and state grants, including the taxpayers of Chicago, who pay about 7% of our budget. So it's difficult and it's uncertain, and it's not something that makes one able to really plan for a thriving, growing future. But as Carlos said, it's important to us that cultural institutions are a part of society, and so we are making it work. But I think we do need to have a conversation more broadly than just cultural institutions about where does the money that's being made in society need to be reinvested for what we think is the public good.
And Gina, can I get just one thing real quick? So people like me seem to be attacking large institutions. We're not attacking them. We care about these institutions. We want them improved. So we're like doctors telling you, don't smoke, it's not good for you. Don't eat junk food. It's not a tax. We want our institutions to be the best institutions in the world, but they need to change. That's how, it's like having kids on your kids. You can't do this. And that's how we feel. We're trying to influence large institutions to change, because I think we have a better comprehension of society than they do, quite honestly. Because, we live in two worlds. We're in the community, and we also go downtown. And so I think we have a much better perspective of what's needed in this country. I think we really do.
Okay, we've got some great questions coming in, including one that I really love. So Bernardo Mendez Lugo is asking us to consider what we mean by culture with a capital C. So do we mean mainstream culture, or can we think of a way of integrating the many different cultures that constitute the culture of the US? And you've been touching on that in various ways. So I wonder if anyone would like to tackle that question.
Culture is a manifestation of creativity by human beings. And the more different cultures we have, the stronger we are as society. I am a proud American. I'm a proud Mexicano. You can be both. I'm a man. I'm a father. I'm a grandfather. You can have multiple identities. And I think the more culture we have, the more we can experience life and enjoy life more and make this country a better country.
I think we also have a role to play as institutions in trying to challenge that story of a mainstream culture, right? Sometimes we imagine a past with, monolithic groups or some mainstream culture. In terms of the American dream, the United States has always been a place where we argue about what it means to be American, and we argue about who's included in American society and there's a lot of exclusion to that as well. But it's there's never been a moment where there was one culture. Now there have been dominant cultures with a great deal more power, but that story of contestation of who gets to tell the story of America and who gets to be included in America, that is the story of American history. So our institutions can help people realize that there are histories to these questions that we're asking today, that are complicated and worth exploring.
Absolutely. We take that exact same approach in thinking through the fact that it is the same sky above, and storytelling is key to demonstrating and talking about the fact that different cultures tell different stories about what they see in the sky above. They tell different stories about astronomical phenomenon like eclipses, and they tell different stories that is rooted in their experience and their cultural history. And we need to take that and showcase that as an example of the richness in the way in which we interpret the same sky that we're seeing above. And then marry that with the fact that as technology advances, as human understanding advances, we can gather new information. We can follow the science to a place where we can gain scientific understanding about some of what is happening that's consistent with our understanding of the world as it works. But that does not need to be exclusive from the fact that we have a richness of cultural storytelling that fuels and feeds the origins of looking up and asking what's going on there. And so I agree completely that we need to celebrate the fact that all of this is rich, and it has been the dominant and the powerful that have been the narrative around the storytelling as to how we got here. And that's what we need to work to change.
But what you have to include, it's been a white dominated.
Yeah.
That has to be said.
Right.
And not saying white. We have to say that.
Absolutely, Carlos. A white dominated storytelling. Absolutely.
We need to say it. We need to say it.
Well, speaking of the ways that we tell stories, we have two questions that I'm going to try to combine here a little bit, both of which deal with education, which, Michelle, you were speaking to quite directly earlier in our conversation. But I know for a fact that all three of you have various kinds of educational programming that speak to this question. So the question is asking if there is direct outreach to teachers in CPS, which I know that there is in all three cases. And then also, what do you do to reach out to different kinds of learners, rather than imposing a sort of homogenous approach to learning? How do you offer different modalities, different approaches to the learning experiences in your institutions? And then if there's anything in particular that you do to reach special education needs, if you could speak to that.
I just want to say that I asked 5 of my friends, all teachers, to start an art museum. So education is in our DNA. In our last accreditation, the 2 people came to review us, said the only institution they know where the education department is equal to the curatorial department. I can tell you many art museums, the director of education has to wait a long time to talk to the director, not the curators. So we've always had a strong educational programming. And we're more than having schools come to us. We send artists. At the moment, we have 37 artists who are working in schools, teaching the arts. These are some of the best artists in our community. If you look at the top Mexican artists in Chicago, overwhelming the majority of them have worked with us in some capacity, either teaching, dancing, painting, music. That's what we're about, education. That's the key. We are, and I would say right now, about 40% of our staff works in education. I don't know any of our museum who does that. Education is the backbone of our institution. So we find we serve every audience. One of the, and we have a lot of groups who come work for us. We have a class we do with adults who have pre-Alzheimer's or Alzheimer's, and we do painting classes with them. I cannot see the class. I always start to cry. They enjoy it so much. So we find all kind of ways to work. We're about inclusivity, accessibility, trying to reach as many people as possible. And if we don't have the expertise, we have no problem finding people who do have the expertise to come work with these students.
Absolutely. So we work with our school group days on Tuesdays and Thursdays for the museum. That's been in partnership with teachers. So we have teachers that are working with us, a whole group, an advisory group of teachers that we could not have done this without. And so they have been instrumental in informing how we go about doing this, how we make it a great experience. We have educators as well, and our educators are participating in developing and leading these conversations with the teachers and the students, the lessons, as well as the free-form experiences. But we also developed over the course of the pandemic a virtual field trip experience so that we could reach Chicago students either pre or post their physical visit to the museum, but also so that we could meet students wherever they are in the world. And so we have a bilingual educator who speaks Spanish and English who teaches the online environment. But this is a different kind of experience. It's a virtual Adler Planetarium that our visualization expert, who does all of our planetarium show visualization, created a virtual Adler, and the students come as avatars. And so they direct the experience with our educator by coming and showing up live as avatar characters that they choose, and not only interacting with Adler staff, but interacting with one another. So just like in a gaming environment, the closer you go to your fellow students, the louder you can hear them. If you walk around the back of the museum, then you don't hear them as loudly, and you can form these conversations in groups. Educators, teachers are in those conversations with us. And we're developing new experiences in that virtual environment with additional advisory groups to help us reach different learning styles in doing that. So agree completely that the whole goal here is to help people see themselves as being a part of discovery and exploration. And so that's important that we get input from those that can help us create experiences that are welcoming.
And we're also working closely with teachers in the Chicago public school system and beyond. We've courses for teachers and students have been going on at the Newberry for a century. But some of the innovations that we've done recently is understanding how difficult it is for teachers and students to get off their own campuses. And so we need to find ways to provide Newberry resources to them. Michelle's talking about this as well. The most visited part of the Newberry website is a section of the website called Digital Collections for the Classroom, where we know that teachers want to be able to use primary sources in their teaching, and we want to be able to provide those sources for them in a free and accessible way, just as they're free and accessible if they would come to the library. So these are kind of lightly curated collections of images from the Newberry collection that teachers can use in their classrooms. And then we've also started a traveling collections program where we're working with schools in the Chicago public school system and beyond to bring collections to schools because we just, anyone working in cultural institutions knows that the economics within schools of funding field trips right now is, not to mention the public health concerns, are just really, really challenging. So it's critically important for us. Again, I mean, we've been talking about this now in multiple ways over the course of the past hour, how all three of these institutions are trying to get beyond our walls to serve people. And for us, when we think about getting beyond our walls, with our collection, teachers and students are at the top of the list.
That's great. So I want to bring another question in from the chat, which has to do with the partnerships that all of y'all have mentioned at various points. So could you talk a little bit more about how you pursue those partnerships and maybe offer some examples of some of the specific partnerships that you have made?
Yeah, I'll speak to playing off of a broader example I was giving before. But so we're developing a new Sky Show right now and wanted to use this opportunity to tell stories about the ways different cultures have interpreted the night sky, have interpreted the cosmos more broadly. And so we wanted to find partners in which we could create that story together, rather than the usual way in which planetaria and museums create these types of experiences, which is with everybody who's inside the museum already. And we wanted to tell the scientific story of multiverse, which is a really dynamic, complex idea that there may be more than one universe, and that we may take on different realities in these different multiverses. And so we had for years worked together with the Afrofuture movement in Chicago and beyond. And so we have partnered with Yatasha Womack, who's an author and leading voice in Afrofuturism, as well as with Taylor Witten, who's a producer and a voice in telling these types of stories, to create and co-create this narrative with us. Our astronomers are also on the team. Our visualization experts are on the team, so that we can tell the cosmological science as well as the cultural interpretation about the universe above. And so we're still in the production stage of that. We are finalizing the script and producing the pieces, but it will be a truly co-created, co-delivered experience for our guests to see at the museum. And we're really excited to have been through that process as collaborators together.
And I'll just say quickly, I talked about the Indigenous Chicago Project. We're also partnering with Indigenous communities in Wisconsin, the Potawatomi, and the Santa Ana Pueblo in New Mexico, to think about, look, our places like ours, like the library, that have long collected materials about Indigenous people across the Americas, have not always been inviting to Indigenous peoples across the Americas. And in fact, those collections have often been hidden to Indigenous peoples across the Americas, just in part because of structural racism, as Carlos has talked about, but also in part because of terminology in searching library catalogs. The Library of Congress subject terms, for example, by which certain communities describe, or that the Library of Congress has used to describe certain Indigenous communities, are not the terms that they use to describe themselves. So they literally cannot find themselves in our collection, even though there are materials at the Newberry that are important to them. So we're piloting a project with Indigenous people in Chicago, the Potawatomi in Wisconsin, and the Santa Ana Pueblo in New Mexico, to work together to try to overcome that, to say, how can we address the racism in library catalogs, right? Because that's ultimately how that is about access to information. And again, like with the Indigenous Chicago Project, we're trying to change the script and not be an institution that walks into a room and pretends that we have all the answers, but co-creates questions and partners together to try to move us forward.
You know, I was going to add that we do tons of partnerships, but we say no to a lot of partnerships. There are a lot of groups who do try to co-opt you, or you want to do they want to do a checkout list. And when I question, so what is it you want to do? And they can't even answer that. They just want to put something down on paper to show funders. That's very sad. And that happens a lot to a lot of organizations of color, especially large institutions trying to do that to small institutions. One of the best partnerships, in fact, I think the best partnership we ever did is happening right now. We are serving as a mentor to 7 other organizations across the country who do stuff on the Mexican culture, and one from San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas, Mexico. And, you know, we don't take a dime for it. In fact, we have gotten 3 Ford Foundation grants, an IMLS grant, to give these organizations money. And we meet every other Wednesday for an hour and a half, and we've met in person, for a couple of days on 3 occasions, and the conversation's in Spanish. And so it's really exciting to be sitting in Chicago to talking to groups across Mexico, and we're all talking in Spanish. They're Donald Trump in your face. And so it's important for us. And what's interesting, every one of the groups has made a sizable leap in the last 2 years of the program. And it's because I sincerely believe it would be hypocritical for my institution and for me to just think that only we should have it in Chicago. I think wherever the Mexican population is found, they need institutions like us, and so we help support them. And we also fund a lot of artists, so we act like a foundation. Sometimes people send us proposals, and we help fund them. Once again, redefining what a cultural institution can be and should be.
That's fantastic. That's a great place, I think, to wrap things up this evening. So I want to thank so much the audience that joined us here this evening for your fantastic questions. And I want to thank this fantastic panel, Daniel Green, president of the Newberry Library, Michelle Larson, president of the Adler Planetarium, and Carlos Tortolero, who is the founder and president of the National Museum of Mexican Art. Thank you so much, and have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.